Welcome to Woo English. Today, we take you inside a true story of power, fear, and history in the making. A war is burning in Europe. Missiles fall. Cities shake. And yet, in the cold silence of the North, a meeting is being prepared. Two of the most powerful men in the world will face each other. Maybe three. It could bring peace. It could start the next world war. From secret visits in Moscow to a snow-covered table in Alaska. This is the story of a summit that might change the future of the planet. Hold your breath. We begin. Chapter 1. Bin Zayed's Surprise. The winter air in Moscow was cold, very cold. Snow fell slowly over the streets, and the Kremlin walls stood dark and silent. Inside the palace, President Vladimir Putin was waiting for someone important. But this time, it was not a general, not a minister, not even a Russian. It was Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the United Arab Emirates. And nobody knew he was coming. No news reporters, no television cameras, no big speeches, just a quiet arrival at the airport and a fast black car driving through the icy streets. When bin Zayed entered the Kremlin, Putin smiled. A rare smile. It was the smile of a man who already knew something big was about to happen. They shook hands. Firm, strong. They sat down in a private room, far away from microphones. What did they talk about? Nobody knows all the details, but we know the result. Everything changed. Until that moment, the war in Ukraine felt endless. Bombs fell, cities burned. Both sides refused to give up. And yet, the arrival of bin Zayed started a new chain of events. Why? Because bin Zayed was not only a leader from the Gulf. He was also a trusted friend to both Washington and Moscow. He could speak to Putin and to Trump, and maybe even to Zelensky. And he had a plan. In Washington, former President Donald Trump was watching. Trump was ready for something big, too. He had been talking for weeks about a deal, a huge deal that could end the war. Putin knew that if such a deal was possible, it needed three things: a location, a plan, and a reason to say yes. The location was the first surprise. Alaska. Why Alaska? Because it is a piece of America, but it once belonged to Russia. It was close enough for both leaders to travel and symbolic enough to make headlines around the world. When news leaked that Putin and Trump were planning to meet there, the world reacted. Some people hoped, some people feared, but everyone was watching. Bin Zayed's visit made the idea of a summit more real. Before, it was just a rumor. Now, it was a possibility. Putin seemed more open. Trump, more confident. Even Zelensky's name began to appear in the conversation, though Putin did not like that. The Kremlin said, "Conditions must be right before any meeting with the Ukrainian president." Still, the thought of all three men at one table was powerful. It would be a meeting unlike any since the end of World War II, a meeting that could stop the bloodshed or push the world closer to the edge. But peace was not the only thing in the air. Danger was also there. In the weeks before bin Zayed's arrival, Trump had sent a warning. Russia had only a few days to agree to a ceasefire. If not, The sanctions are coming. These would not be ordinary sanctions. Trump had another card to play. He announced the deployment of 2 nuclear submarines. He didn't say where, but he made sure everyone understood the message. They carried nuclear warheads. Moscow replied quickly. Russia would lift its own limits on deploying medium-range missiles that could also carry nuclear warheads. It was a dangerous dance. One wrong move, and the world could fall into a new arms race. And yet, amid the threats, bin Zayed's visit brought something different. Possibility. In the halls of the Kremlin that day, 2 leaders talked quietly. Maybe they spoke of maps. Maybe they spoke of oil. Maybe they spoke of promises and secrets. But one thing was certain. The cold Moscow night had just become warmer for diplomacy. Somewhere in Alaska, the snow was waiting. The stage was being built. The players were getting ready. And the world? The world was holding its breath. Would this surprise lead to peace or to the biggest gamble of the century? Chapter 2. Alaska, the summit stage. The news broke like a winter storm. Short, sharp. Every TV anchor said the same words, Putin and Trump will meet in Alaska. The world was shocked. Not Washington, not Moscow, not Geneva, Paris, or Beijing. Alaska. Why Alaska? Because it was more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol. Long ago, Alaska was Russian territory. In 1867, the United States bought it for $7.2 million, a bargain that historians still talk about. Now, over 150 years later, it would host 2 men who could change the future of the world. The choice of Alaska was clever. For Trump, it was American soil, strong, proud, and under his country's flag. For Putin, it was a reminder of Russia's long history and power in the region. And for both men, it was neutral enough to be safe, but dramatic enough to make every headline. Hotels in Anchorage, the capital of Alaska, began receiving strange phone calls. Private flights were being booked. Security teams were asking about rooftops, underground parking, and helicopter pads. The city didn't know it yet, but it was becoming the center of the world. In Washington, Trump played the role of the deal-maker. He told his aides, "This is going to be huge, bigger than anyone imagines." He called it the Alaska Agreement before it even existed. He wanted cameras. He wanted flags. He wanted the image of a handshake that would circle the globe. In Moscow, Putin was more careful. He didn't promise peace. He didn't promise anything. But his advisors noticed something rare. He didn't say no. Still, there was one question everyone asked. Would Volodymyr Zelensky be there? Some in Washington liked the idea. All 3 men at one table. Others warned it could explode before it even began. Putin gave his answer. Not yet. The Kremlin said the conditions were not ready. They didn't trust Zelensky. They didn't even like saying his name. But the rumor did not die. Behind the scenes, diplomats were already thinking of a second meeting, the Triple Summit. In Alaska, preparations began quietly. The local governor received a call from Washington. No details, just an order. Get ready. FBI agents flew in. So did the Secret Service. Russian security officials arrived too, inspecting every possible route, every hotel floor, every kitchen. Anchorage's streets were calm, but the air was full of whispers. Something historic was coming. Yet outside the meeting rooms, the war in Ukraine was still burning. Russian missiles hit new targets. Ukrainian drones struck back. Families kept fleeing the cities. People wondered, could two men meeting in a snowy American state really stop all this? Trump thought so. At least, that's what he said. To his supporters, he promised the deal of the century. To his critics, he warned, the alternative is worse, much worse. Putin stayed silent. But inside the Kremlin, maps were being studied. Lines were being drawn. Plans were being written. Plans that could redraw Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the media went wild. Every photo of Alaska was used. Mountains, glaciers, eagles, oil fields. Some newspapers even showed pictures of the 1867 treaty signing, calling this history repeating itself. But it wasn't just history. It was power, and both men wanted it. In a small control room somewhere in Washington, a giant map of Alaska glowed on a wall. On another wall, the same map glowed inside a secure bunker in Moscow. Two nations were looking at the same place, the same future, and maybe the same risk. Snow kept falling on Anchorage. The city's lights shone in the dark, like candles before a storm. Soon, two planes would land. Two motorcades would move. Two leaders would shake hands. And the world would hold its breath again. Chapter 3, Zelensky on Demand. The news came quietly at first, a whisper in a hallway, a line in a newspaper that most people missed. Then it grew louder. Zelensky might join the Alaska summit. The idea was explosive. For Ukraine, it was hope. For Russia, it was trouble. For America, it was a gamble. In Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky was in his office, reading reports. The war had been long, too long. Every day brought new damage, new funerals, new faces of children leaving their homes. He knew any real peace deal needed him at the table, but he also knew the problem. Vladimir Putin didn't want him there. In Moscow, the Kremlin's message was cold. Conditions are not ready. Putin saw Zelensky not as a partner, but as an enemy, maybe even an obstacle to peace. He told his aides, "We talk to him only if it serves our terms." To many in Russia, the idea of Putin and Zelensky sitting across from each other was unthinkable. It wasn't just politics, it was personal. But in Washington, Donald Trump saw opportunity. He knew the cameras would love it. 3 leaders, 1 table, and the world watching. It will be the picture of the century, he told an advisor. It will make history. His team began testing the idea, speaking to diplomats, making quiet calls to Kyiv. The message was simple. Be ready. In the Gulf, Mohammed bin Zayed followed every update. He had already helped bring Putin and Trump closer. Now, he was thinking about the next step. Could he use his position, his friendships, to bring in Zelensky too? If he could, the UAE would not just be a mediator. It would be the bridge to peace. But time was short. The Alaska summit was only weeks away. Preparations were moving fast: security, travel, secret agreements. Adding Zelensky would mean more risk, more tension. Every intelligence agency warned the same thing: one wrong word, and the talks will collapse. Still, the rumor kept growing. In Kyiv, journalists asked Zelensky directly, "Will you go to Alaska?" He didn't answer. He smiled, then said, "We will go where peace can be made." In Moscow, the reaction was sharper. A Kremlin spokesman said, "President Putin will not meet Zelensky unless the situation changes." But diplomats noticed something important. They didn't say never. Behind closed doors, secret channels were busy. American envoys met Ukrainian advisors. Russian contacts passed quiet messages through Gulf mediators. Some drafts of the Alaska Agreement even had 3 chairs in the meeting room: one for Putin, one for Trump, one for Zelensky. In Alaska, organizers began to prepare for both possibilities: 2 chairs, or 3, 2 flags, or 3, 2 security teams, or, well, 3 very nervous security teams. The challenge was huge. Each leader had his own guards, his own rules, his own fears. And in a single room, all of that could turn dangerous in seconds. For the people of Ukraine, the possibility was emotional. Some saw Zelensky's presence as strength. Others feared it could be a trap. In Russia, the state media warned against it, calling Zelensky the obstacle to stability. In America, the news channels argued day and night. Was this smart diplomacy, or a risk too big to take? And somewhere far from the cameras, a list was being written. A list of conditions that might make the meeting possible. A ceasefire, a partial withdrawal, an agreement on disputed territories. Each condition was a mountain to climb. But if they could be climbed, maybe, just maybe, all 3 men could sit at one table. The snow in Alaska kept falling. The meeting room stayed empty, the chairs waiting. Would there be 2 or 3? That was the question everyone asked. And if there were 3, would it lead to peace or to the shortest summit in history? Chapter 4. Under the Nuclear Shadow. The sky over the Arctic was dark. Cold winds moved across the ice. Somewhere under that ice, a submarine was moving. Not just any submarine, a nuclear submarine. One of the most dangerous weapons in the world. Donald Trump had made the announcement himself. 2 nuclear submarines were now on patrol. He didn't say where. He didn't have to. The message was clear. America was ready to show its teeth. In Moscow, the Kremlin understood the signal. They didn't panic. They answered. Russia announced it would lift its own restrictions on deploying medium-range missiles. Missiles that could also carry nuclear warheads. The meaning was simple. If you move your pieces, we will move ours. It was a dangerous game. One wrong step, one misunderstanding, and the world could be back in a nuclear arms race. And this was happening just weeks before the Alaska summit. In Washington, Trump's team said the move was necessary. They wanted to pressure Russia into coming to the table ready to deal. In Moscow, Putin's team said it was expected. They believed America was trying to intimidate them, and they would not bend. Around the world, leaders watched with concern. In Europe, NATO officials began holding emergency meetings. In Asia, Japan and South Korea followed every development. Even in the Middle East, Gulf states wondered if the Alaska summit would happen at all. On the streets, ordinary people felt the tension. In Kyiv, mothers worried about more air raids. In Moscow, fathers spoke in hushed tones about military service for their sons. In New York, people remembered old nuclear drills from the Cold War. Inside military command rooms, the atmosphere was even more tense. Maps were lit up with red lines and blinking signals. Naval officers tracked movements in the oceans. Missile specialists checked and rechecked their launch systems. Yet, at the same time, diplomacy was still alive. Even with submarines in the water and missiles ready, messages were being passed. American envoys spoke to Russian contacts. Gulf intermediaries kept lines open. Both sides knew the truth. The closer they came to the edge, the more valuable the summit became. In Alaska, the meeting room was being checked again. Security teams installed listening devices and devices to block listening. Bulletproof glass was tested. Escape routes were planned. It was strange to think that while two leaders prepared to shake hands, their armies were preparing for war. Trump used the tension as part of his strategy. He told reporters, "Peace is better when it's backed by strength." Putin, in his usual style, didn't respond directly. But Russian state TV showed footage of missile launch drills in Siberia. It was their own way of speaking without words. For the people of Alaska, life went on. Fishing boats, snowplows, children going to school. But they knew their home was about to become the center of the world. And now, it was also in the shadow of nuclear weapons. As the days passed, the pressure grew. Would the nuclear threats push the leaders toward compromise? Or make them dig in deeper? No one could be sure. But one thing was certain. When Putin and Trump sat across from each other in Alaska, the weight of the world's weapons would sit between them. The snow kept falling. The submarines kept moving. The missiles stayed ready. And the world kept waiting. Chapter 5. Diplomacy on the Edge. In the days before the Alaska summit, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Every hour brought new rumors. Every headline carried a mix of hope and fear. In Washington, Donald Trump worked the phones. He spoke to the German Chancellor, the British Prime Minister, the NATO Secretary General, and always, he spoke to his closest advisors about the deal. "This is the moment," he told them. "If we get it right, history remembers us. If we get it wrong, well, we don't get it wrong." In Moscow, Vladimir Putin was more silent. He met with his generals in rooms without windows. He spoke to foreign ministers from friendly nations. He asked questions and listened more than he talked. To his team, he said, "We go to Alaska prepared. For peace or for pressure?" Behind the scenes, small teams of diplomats worked day and night. Americans and Russians used secret channels, messages carried through Gulf states, whispered in hotel lobbies, hidden in diplomatic pouches. At one meeting in Abu Dhabi, a Russian envoy slid a single piece of paper across the table to an American counterpart. It had only 5 lines on it. 5 points that could, if accepted, open the door to an agreement. But the list was not easy. It spoke of territory, of troops, of weapons. It was, in many ways, a list of impossible demands. Still, the Americans didn't throw it away. They marked it, changed it, and sent it back through the same quiet channels. Meanwhile, Ukraine was not silent. President Volodymyr Zelensky gave an interview saying, "If there is a real path to peace, Ukraine will walk it, but it must be a path of honor." Some saw this as an open hand. Others saw it as a warning. And then, there was the Gulf. The UAE and Saudi Arabia continued their quiet work. They didn't speak much to the press, but insiders knew they were speaking to everyone else. They hosted dinners with no cameras, meetings where cell phones were left outside, conversations that could change the course of the war. Still, the shadow of the nuclear threats hung over everything. Military exercises continued. Ships moved in the oceans. Satellites tracked missile sites. It was diplomacy with a ticking clock. A clock that no one could see, but everyone could hear. In Alaska, the final preparations were almost done. The meeting room was set. The flags were ready. 2 for now, but a third was folded and hidden, just in case. Anchorage's streets had more police, more black cars, more men with earpieces. From the outside, it looked calm. But from the inside, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Late one night, a plane landed quietly in a small Alaskan airfield. On board were senior negotiators from both sides. They came without press, without ceremony. They met in a wooden lodge far from the city lights. For 6 hours, they spoke in low voices. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they laughed. Once, they even shook hands. When they left, no one knew exactly what had been decided. But those who were there said the mood had changed. There was possibility. As the sun rose over the snowy mountains, the 2 great capitals prepared for the final step. The leaders were coming. The stage was ready. But the question remained, were they coming to make peace, or to prove they could walk to the very edge and not fall? The answer would come soon. Very soon. Chapter 6. Europe's Deal of the Century. The morning was cold in Brussels. Gray clouds covered the city. Inside the European Council building, ministers gathered around a long, polished table. They were not there to make a decision. They were there to react. React to the news from Washington and Moscow. A draft agreement had been prepared. A possible end to the war. It was already being called the Deal of the Century. The draft was short, only a few pages, but the words on those pages were heavy, like stone. It began with the most urgent point, a ceasefire. All fighting would stop within 48 hours of signing. Then came the second point, a gradual Russian withdrawal. Troops would leave certain areas over 6 months, but not all areas. 4 regions in eastern Ukraine and Crimea would remain under Russian control for now. The status of these territories would be frozen under a Hong Kong-style arrangement. The third point shook the room in Brussels. Ukraine would pause its NATO membership request for at least 10 years. To the Americans, this was a strategic compromise. To the Russians, it was a victory. To many Europeans, it was dangerous. The fourth point offered Ukraine sovereign guarantees, a promise that Western nations, led by the U.S., would defend Ukraine if the ceasefire was broken. The fifth point was about rebuilding. A massive fund, billions of dollars, to repair Ukraine's cities, roads, and power plants. The money would come from both the West and Gulf states. In Brussels, reactions were divided. France was silent. Its president had not even been invited to the Alaska summit. Germany was frustrated, informed only at the last minute. Britain was listening, but not leading. Some saw the deal as hope. Others saw it as surrender. Meanwhile, in Kiev, the news spread quickly. Some Ukrainians welcomed the possibility of peace. Others filled the streets in protest, holding banners that read, "No land for peace." Zelensky's government said it was studying the terms carefully. They knew rejecting the deal could mean more war, but accepting it could cost them politically, maybe even personally. In Moscow, state TV celebrated the draft. They showed maps with new borders, smiling commentators, and phrases like, "a new chapter for Russia." Putin himself stayed quiet, but his silence spoke loudly. In Washington, Trump told reporters, "This could be the greatest peace deal in modern history, and we're doing it in Alaska." European diplomats were uneasy. They feared a deal made without Europe's full involvement would weaken NATO. Some whispered about being cut out of the process. But no matter how they felt, the truth was clear. The main decisions were now in the hands of Washington, Moscow, and maybe Kiev. Back in Alaska, the meeting room waited. On the table were 3 nameplates, still 2 for now, but the third one was ready in a drawer. Security was tight. The air outside was sharp and cold, the kind that makes your breath visible. Inside, the air was even colder, but not from the weather. It was the kind of cold that comes when history is about to be made or broken. The snow kept falling. The world kept watching. And somewhere between the frozen mountains and the heated capitals, the deal of the century waited for its moment. Would it be signed with smiles and handshakes, or torn apart in anger before the cameras even started rolling? Only Alaska would know. Chapter 7. Europe on the Sidelines. Paris, Berlin, London. 3 capitals that had shaped Europe for centuries. Now, they were watching from the sidelines. The Alaska summit was days away. The draft agreement was on the table. But Europe, the continent closest to the war, had been left out of the real decision-making. France was not invited. Germany was only informed after the terms were already written. Britain was listening, but not leading. It was a bitter moment. In Paris, the French president paced in his office. He called his advisors. He called allies. But the truth was simple. Washington and Moscow were in control. And in between them stood the Gulf states, playing the role of mediators. France, once the loud voice in Europe's diplomacy, was now silent. In Berlin, the German chancellor was frustrated. Germany had given Ukraine billions in aid. It had accepted millions of refugees. It had faced an energy crisis because of the war. And yet, when it came to the Alaska summit, Berlin was a spectator, not a player. Some German officials whispered, "This is America's show now, and Russia's." In London, the Prime Minister chose a different approach. Britain had long been close to Washington, so instead of protesting, they listened and waited. They hoped that by staying close to Trump's circle, they could still shape parts of the deal. Across Europe, NATO members held private meetings. They discussed what the deal of the century would mean for the alliance. If Ukraine paused its NATO bid, would that make Europe safer or weaker? If Russia kept its hold on captured regions, would that encourage other powers to take more land by force? These were not easy questions. In Brussels, the mood was tense. The European Union had promised unity since the first day of the war. Now that unity was cracking. Some leaders wanted to support the deal, hoping it would stop the bloodshed. Others wanted to oppose it, fearing it would reward aggression. Meanwhile, the streets of European cities told a different story. In Berlin, people held peace marches, carrying signs that read, "Enough war, talk peace." In Warsaw, people rallied for Ukraine, waving blue and yellow flags and chanting, "No compromise on freedom." Europe's people were as divided as its leaders. In private, some European diplomats tried to push their way into the process. They sent messages to Trump's team. They reached out to Russian contacts. They even asked the UAE and Saudi Arabia for a seat at the table. The answer, in polite diplomatic language, was the same. Not this time. For Europe, it was a wake-up call. The future of their continent was being decided thousands of kilometers away, by powers that did not need their permission. In Alaska, none of this mattered to the organizers. They had one goal: make the summit happen. Two leaders, or maybe three, sitting together under the same roof. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the chairs stayed empty. In Paris, Berlin, and London, leaders watched the cold Alaskan sky on television. They could only guess what would be said in that room. They could only prepare for the consequences. Europe had once been the stage for history. Now, it was in the audience, waiting for the next act. Chapter 8. Pressuring the Allies. The Alaska summit was not just about Putin and Trump. It was also about the people standing behind them, the allies, the partners, the silent players who could make the deal work or make it fail. In Washington, Donald Trump had a plan. If you wanted peace, you had to put pressure where it hurt, in the wallets of your friends. The message to America's allies was clear. Help push Russia, or face consequences. China was the first target. Beijing had continued buying Russian oil throughout the war. It had signed trade deals with Moscow, giving Putin a financial lifeline. Trump's team sent private warnings. Cut back on Russian energy, or face American sanctions. Chinese officials listened, but didn't commit. Publicly, they said they wanted peace. Privately, they calculated how much pressure they could take and how much money they were making from cheap oil. Next came India. Like China, India had also bought large amounts of Russian oil. New Delhi valued its old friendship with Moscow, but it also valued its growing relationship with Washington. Trump played that balance like a card game. He reminded India of trade benefits with the U.S. He hinted at military cooperation deals, and in the same breath, he warned of tariffs and restrictions if they kept fueling Putin's war. In Europe, the pressure was more subtle. America didn't threaten directly. Instead, it reminded NATO members of their defense commitments. Peace in Ukraine, Trump told one European leader over the phone, is in everyone's interest, and I mean everyone's. In the Gulf, the message was different. To the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Trump offered praise. "You're making history," he told them. "You're helping build the bridge to peace." But even praise had its own pressure. The Gulf states knew that if the Alaska summit failed, they would share the blame and lose the diplomatic victory they had worked so hard to build. Moscow watched all of this carefully. Putin knew Trump's style: push hard in public, offer deals in private. The Kremlin had its own allies: China, India, some African nations, and it worked to keep them close. Russian diplomats promised new trade routes, military support, and discounts on oil and gas. It was a quiet battle, fought far from the cameras. As the summit date grew closer, the pressure campaign intensified. In Beijing, meetings went late into the night. In New Delhi, ministers weighed oil prices against political risk. In European capitals, leaders worried about being caught between American demands and their own public opinion. Trump's team believed that if Russia felt its friends pulling away, even slightly, it would come to Alaska ready to sign. Putin's team believed that if their allies stayed loyal, they could negotiate from a position of strength. The truth was somewhere in between. On the streets of Anchorage, none of this could be seen. Tourists took pictures of snow-covered mountains. Fishermen unloaded their catches. Shops sold postcards and hot coffee. But behind closed doors, in capitals across the world, the Alaska summit was shaping decisions on oil, trade, and alliances. Pressure is a strange thing in diplomacy. Too little, and nothing changes. Too much, and the whole structure can break. Trump was betting that his kind of pressure, bold, loud, and public, would hold. Putin was betting that his kind of pressure, quiet, steady, and behind the scenes, would win. Only a few days remained to see whose bet was right. Chapter 9. Peace or Explosion. The morning air in Anchorage was sharp and cold. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the gray sky. Police cars and black SUVs lined the streets. The city felt different, like it was holding a secret. 2 planes were on their way. One from Washington. One from Moscow. Inside each, the most powerful man in his country was preparing for a meeting that could end a war or start something far worse. Donald Trump sat in a leather seat, flipping through notes. He rehearsed his opening lines. He wanted strength and a smile for the cameras. Vladimir Putin sat in silence. He read no papers. He simply stared out the window at the endless white clouds, his mind turning over every possibility. At the airport, security was tighter than anyone had seen before. Secret Service agents stood shoulder to shoulder with Russian guards. Helicopters circled overhead. Snipers watched from rooftops. The summit was no longer an idea. It was here. Inside the hotel where the meeting would take place, the room was ready. A long table, 2 nameplates, 2 flags, and in a drawer, hidden but ready, a 3rd flag and a 3rd nameplate, just in case Zelensky arrived at the last moment. Reporters filled the lobby. Cameras waited in the snow. The whole world was watching live. In Kyiv, Families gathered around televisions. In Moscow, crowds watched on giant screens in public squares. In New York, people followed the news on their phones, even during work. Everyone asked the same question. Will this bring peace, or will it blow up in our faces? The motorcades arrived within minutes of each other. Trump stepped out first, waving to the cameras. Putin emerged second, his face calm, unreadable. They shook hands at the door, a handshake that lasted just a little too long. The photographers clicked wildly. The sound of shutters was like a storm of tiny drums. Inside, the doors closed. The world could no longer see, only imagine. At first, the room was quiet. Trump spoke about ending the bloodshed and making the deal of the century. Putin listened, his hands folded. Then Putin spoke about security guarantees and respecting realities on the ground. Trump nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp. Somewhere far away, Zelensky waited by a phone. If he was called, he would come. If not, history would be written without him. The talks went on for hours. There were moments of agreement and moments when voices rose. One aide described it later as a mix of smiles and ice. Outside, the crowd of journalists grew restless. Rumors began to spread. They're close to a deal. They've hit a deadlock. No, they're taking a break. No one knew the truth. In the evening, the doors opened. Trump and Putin walked out together. They stood in front of the flags. Trump spoke first. "We have made progress," he said. "We are closer to peace than we were yesterday." Putin's turn. "The conversation was serious," he said, "and it will continue." No signatures, no full agreement, but no collapse either. The world exhaled, but only halfway. There was still no peace. There was still no war's end. Just a pause. As night fell over Alaska, the question remained. Was this the first step toward ending the conflict, or just a brief moment before the storm? Somewhere in the snowy darkness, the answer waited, and the world kept watching.